You want to know if I believe in ghosts? Well, a few years ago, something did happen. I was in the Black Hills. I was staying in one of those little hotels, on the main street of town and upstairs from a bar. The kind of place that calls itself historic so that you won't call it old first. But I like old buildings. I can't help it. I'm sentimental. I like the dusty floors that creak under your feet. And I especially liked this one because it wasn't just old, it was kitschy. It had this cheap wooden hand-painted sign out on the door that said, "Home of Calamity Jane's Ghost." I liked that. I thought if it pleased the ghost of Calamity Jane to pay me a visit in the middle of the night, I'd ask her if she'd do me the honor of a handshake and a drink. Anyway, that night in the bar, there was this man, not the only other person in the place, but you got the feeling that he felt as though he were. It seemed to me like he wasn't just passing through the way I was, but that he didn't exactly live there either. Turned out I was right. I usually am. "I'm here to look at trees," he said when I asked him about it, and then he didn't say anything more after that. We got to talking, though. His name was Wayne, and he was about 10, 15 years older than me, tall and lanky, with scrapes on the back of his knuckles and down one side of his face. He was friendly in a quiet way. The only time he didn't smile politely at me was when I joked with him about that sign out on the door. "Have you seen the ghost?" I said. Wayne looked away to take a sip of his drink. I waited. He kept his mouth on the glass for a long time after he'd stopped drinking. And I realized I'd hit a nerve, so I quickly changed the subject to something else. And when we went up to our rooms that night, I told him that I was looking forward to the view from my window of the sun rising over those black mountains. "It's something to see," he said. "You enjoy that, Lou." "You too, Wayne," I told him. And he did a funny thing. He smiled at the same time as he shook his head. I slept well, but at just before dawn, I was woken by this small sound right outside my door. Now, it was dark in my room, and I was half asleep, and I had this moment, before I realized how silly it was, I had this moment where I said to myself, "Here it is." Then the sound stopped. The room didn't go cold, and no bloody face materialized above my bed either. I even fell back asleep. Slept right through the sunrise, too. When I was leaving the next morning, I found out what that sound had been. It was a pile of papers being shoved under my door. Beautiful longhand on notebook paper. And there was a note on the first page from Wayne. "I'm off to the woods," it said. "Though I'm not sure how long I'll last today. I was up all night writing you a story. I think maybe I wanted to write it for a long time." What in the world was this? There had to be at least 20 pages here. I thought the guy must be unstable, and I was surprised I hadn't seen it. Usually I'm pretty quick to spot that kind of a thing. Or maybe it was a confession of his love for me. I hadn't gotten that vibe from him at the bar, but then even I can miss something once in a while. But it turned out it was nothing like that. That night, at a different motel in a different small town, this time in Montana, I read Wayne's story. I never threw it away. And since you were asking about ghosts, I went digging around until I found it. I've got it right here, so I'll read it to you. I don't think he would mind. This happened in an old house in St. Paul, in a neighborhood called Crocus Hill, to my old friend Polly and me. I'll tell you everything that went on as well as I can remember it, but as for trying to say what I think it all means, I'd rather not talk about that. We got to St. Paul on the last evening in May. We were renting the house, a 3-story Victorian, for the summer. Polly liked the place. I think she did. How all the little flowers and the big trees stood up very straight. Nothing creeping around, nothing overblown. That was just right for Polly. She did wait a second before following me inside. She paused on the steps. I looked back from opening the door, and she was looking past me into the shadows of the house. "This is a funny place, isn't it?" she said. It wasn't funny, no. It was fantastic. Spacious, bright, blonde wood floors, windows everywhere. Our first morning, I walked the length of the first level, back and forth. All the windows were open. A breeze hit the back of my neck, and I felt a warmth, a lightness bubble up into my chest. I might not have felt anything so pleasantly intense since I was about 21 and going out on a fine summer Saturday night, the kind when anything in the world could happen. The whole house felt happy. I picked up a pillow from one of the sofas and lobbed it 20 feet into the air. Polly, curled up in a bay window in her nightgown, cried out laughing, "For God's sakes, don't break anything, Wayne." I told her it didn't matter. I felt sure of it, that every generation of boys that had lived in this house had given in to the temptation of tossing a ball to one another as they ran through these big, light rooms. Our first week there, Polly and I mostly got drunk and recited poetry. We told stories about our wild old days. We also had some perfect walks together in the neighborhood, with its sprawling Tudors and hilly streets, its big old firs and maples. Back in the house, we were deciding where we wanted to sleep. We both liked the 3rd-floor bedroom. It was stuffy, but it had a king-sized bed, and you woke up in the leafy arms of a big oak tree. On our first few nights, we slept up there together, but that wouldn't hold as the weather got warmer. One morning, I woke up first and looked at Polly. She was looking as pretty as I had ever seen her, happier, too, and that was saying something. Her brown-black hair was fairly gray now, and this past year had been a tough one for her. She'd been a very beautiful, light-hearted girl. After a while, she opened her eyes. I was feeling generous, and I told her to take the room. Polly sat up yawning and looked around. "You don't think it'll be spooky, sleeping way up here all by myself?" she said. I told her I didn't think I'd ever seen a less spooky house. "Well, I guess it's time we got to work," Polly said in the 2nd week of June. I groaned. Polly was a painter. She made drawings of prairie dogs, berries, Scandinavian trolls, tinted them in elegant colors. They were the loveliest things. She couldn't wait to get to work. In theory, neither could I. Polly had sent a few pictures ahead of time to some local galleries and had already sold a few. That was good because she needed the money. Her mother had died the previous summer, and Polly had spent most of the 6 months prior taking care of her, instead of being able to make work and to pal around the art fairs with me. She was still paying off the funeral bills. But she said that as long as she got a lot of work done this summer and it kept on selling, she would be able to keep herself above water all right. I built rustic wood furniture. I liked the bark and the wormholes. I'd come to Minnesota with a waiting list of projects and a truckload of tools and wood. I never had the problem of drumming up enough commissions to support myself. I had other problems. That morning, Polly wandered the house to find a good sketching room. At lunchtime, I found her on the second floor in a rose-colored bedroom shaded by a thick fir. "What a beautiful room," I said. "It's conspiring against me," said Polly. Just at that moment, a breeze seemed to blow the sunshine in. It was so soft and warm, we couldn't do a thing but watch it stir up the room, from a rumple in the curtains to the skitter of a scrap of drawing paper across the golden floor. From a jar full of daisies on Polly's desk, the wind picked a petal and set it down in her dark hair. The room swelled with the scent of sweet mock orange. "Polly, look at that," I said. "There he is." Polly smiled. She touched the white petal. She came downstairs to eat a sandwich, but after a half hour, she started to squirm. Finally, I let her go. She kept at it all day. The next day, the same. I don't know how she did it. The perfect weather was holding. Around us, the house and the yard were putting on a show. The light in every room looked as if it had been infused with honey. Outside, fragrant purple petals clouded the air. The sweetness of the birds was enough to break your heart. I started to feel a little lonely. All of this spring fever, and no one to share it with. Soon I had to beg Polly to go out, even just on a short walk. Even on these evenings that were so tender, so sweet. I'd never seen anything like them. And I'll never see anything like them again. Polly would just switch on a lamp and go on with it. I told her she knew what might happen if I went out alone. She just rolled her eyes and said I was a big boy. She got better at resisting the enchantments of the house as well. One morning, I watched her climb the stairs to her workspace, leaving me alone with my café au lait and my copy of Spring and Fall. Her dress must have caught on something. She was pulled back for a second. She yanked the material loose and kept going. I took a walk alone. I found a bicycle in the basement and went farther, up and down the Mississippi. But I missed Polly. It was no fun exploring by myself. Coming home, I thought, no, this was no good. I needed friends and fun. If nothing else, I needed a drink. I wheeled onto our street, and everything looked nice, as always. Our dove-gray behemoth with its wide roof, the front and sides dotted with porthole windows, like a great wooden ark. Then I heard a scream from the top of the house. I ran up the stairs. Polly was in her bedroom on the third floor. "Oh, shit! Shit!" she was crying. She'd had an accident with one of the windows, a disaster. It had come smashing down on her right hand. Polly was kneeling on the floor, dripping blood on the carpet. I got one look at the pulpy mess, a fingertip dangling by pieces of skin, and had to get to an open window for some air. Beside it, the offending window was shut tight. It had slammed down so hard there were flakes of yellow-white paint on the sill. One of them was picked up by the wind and carried into the room. The chip swooped and dipped and hung a moment before coming to rest on the floor. I looked away. This was no time for the house to be acting so pretty and cute. On the way home from the hospital, Polly told me there was something odd about that window. She said that at first it seemed to be staying up fine. Then it had come crashing down on its own. I guess it must have been the ghost, I said. Polly didn't laugh. I glanced at her. She was looking at her casted hand in her lap. She moved it, and there was a sweat stain on her dress. It had gotten to 87 that day, the first really warm day of the summer. I won't be able to draw, she said quietly. Don't think about that now, I said. That evening, we went back to the third floor. I opened the window halfway and waited. I pushed it all the way up, and we stood a while with the humid air coming in. The roses and the mock orange smelled a little cooked in the heat. I expected completely that the window would fall. I kept thinking I saw it begin to slip. It was like watching a robin in the grass. We heard the trill of a blackbird. I inspected the window more closely. It looked fine. I wondered if Polly had somehow managed to shut it on herself. I didn't look at her, but I could feel her watching me as I wiped dried blood from the sill. It doesn't make much sense, I said, but it must have had something to do with the change in the weather. Polly nodded slowly. After a moment, she told me that I could take the third floor bedroom after all. She was going to sleep in her art room on the second floor from now on. Before we went our separate ways to bed, I hugged her. I told her not to worry. I was going to take care of everything. As I fell asleep, I told myself that when it came to money and the time I spent working, I would have to be more careful, since, depending on how her hand healed, I might have to swing some cash for Polly. The next day, painters arrived. the outer walls of the house would be going from gray to a cheery yellow. Watching 70-year-old Jim and his nephew Kyle set up scaffolding, I was inspired to go into the basement and get to work myself on the bird's eye maple table I was making for a client in South Carolina. Polly was groggy on painkillers and slept all afternoon. At first, I liked being back to work, but being alone all day got a little boring. The next morning, I woke up sweating in the big bed on the 3rd floor. This was the 3rd hot day in a row. The curtains fluttered, giving me a clear view of a row of the scaffolding and of the figure sauntering across it. I'd talked to Kyle for a moment yesterday, but I hadn't thought much about him. A good enough looking kid, small and thin, but not my type. A little young, and he seemed sullen and lazy. This morning, though, something was different. Through the leaves of the oak tree and a kind of golden haze of pollen dust, all of a sudden, blonde, Nordic-looking, wavy-haired Kyle looked as thirsty and sweet to me as Hellas must have looked to the nymphs. It was all very strange and surreal. I watched him for a long time before going down to have breakfast with Polly. I found her slowly spreading peanut butter on a piece of toast and looking out the kitchen window at Jim setting up more scaffolding. She was already worrying about her hospital bills. "Don't," I told her. "By the time they get sent, we might be back down south. Then maybe they won't be able to find you." Polly scolded me. She didn't like it when I dodged my debts, and she said that she certainly wasn't going to start following my bad example. Polly jumped. She'd already stopped taking her painkillers, and she was nervy this morning. Through the kitchen window, I saw a pair of feet going up a ladder. Before we'd even finished eating, Polly said, "Go ahead, get to work now. I don't mind. I feel like a jerk when I know how much you'd like to. You don't have to entertain me. I've got plenty to do," she said. Behind us, the screen door banged. "Howdy there," said white-haired Jim, as he and Kyle came in to gulp down the first round of the gallons of water they would require in order to battle back the humidity and sunshine and Iowa corn sweat. The heat index was 99 degrees, frequently rising over 100. Jim gave us a quick wave over his head and ducked under it on his way to the sink. He was curious about us and pleasant to talk to, while the smirking, silent Kyle, with his wheat-colored hair and rakishly sagged jeans, might really have been the devil. They took a while to get back to work. Part of that was my fault. I asked Kyle questions about summer breaks and school, and he answered slowly, as if to draw out the suspense. He'd graduated the year before. He gauged first Polly's reaction, and then mine, and responded by putting on a variety of poses against the table and countertop. No, I wouldn't be his first choice, but he might be the kind of young man who could sometimes be persuaded to come over to the gentleman's side, provided he didn't have to do too much. "Oh, Wayne, no," Polly said in a low voice when we were out on the porch late that afternoon drinking cold wine. Polly caught me watching Kyle half slump, half swagger by. "All the men look like Kyle here," Polly said. "Go find one of them, not him." Then she sighed. "You're not going to work at all today, are you?" It was true. I hadn't taken one step in the direction of the dark basement. It should have felt cooler on a day like today than it did. "It's too hot today," I said. "I'll get back to it tomorrow." "What if it's hot tomorrow?" "It can't last," I said. "Isn't this Minnesota?" That night, I went to sleep with the windows wide open. I was looking forward to waking up on that big, firm mattress, to the scuff of Kyle's sneakers on the wooden planks just outside. But when I woke up, everything was muffled and cool. I heard the purr of the central air. My windows were shut. Polly must have crept into the room while I was asleep. Downstairs, I complained. I thought we'd decided to go green this summer. Well, Polly said, not looking at me, it's better for the paintings. She was cleaning the living room with her left hand. She pointed her feather duster at a 19th century oil of a bird dog hanging over the fireplace. I like it hot, I said. Just to show that I knew her real motives, I didn't go down to the basement once that morning. But watching Polly wander from one corner to another with her dustpan, I began to soften. Poor thing, she was just worried. Her voice was going up high and thin, and her broom seemed to have a heavy weight dragging on it. I told her not to work herself up about things. While I didn't have a lot of cash myself, everything we needed was there in my pile of wood. I got down to my workbench for a few hours that afternoon. At about 4, I was sanding a board when I heard a sound somewhere in the house, a clank of some kind. I put down my block and looked around. Now the house seemed quieter than it had before. I poked around in a few of the basement's dark corners. There were some big snowshoes hanging on the walls, antique tennis rackets, a sled, a pair of dried-out rubber flippers. This had been a lively house once. Lots of young people. I got back to work, and at 5, the basement began to get stuffy. Upstairs, the heat was even closer. I opened one of the front windows and waved to Jim and Kyle, knocking off for the day. Polly came into the front room frowning. "What did you do?" "What do you mean?" I said. "If you're going to turn off the air, for God's sakes, don't do it without opening the windows." "I didn't turn it off," Polly said. It says it's still on, but there's nothing coming out of the vents. Well, I don't know. You weren't screwing around with it, Polly said and gave me a suspicious look. I looked back out the window. Kyle's shirt rose above his waistline when he reached up to pull down the gate on his truck. No, I said to Polly. Wayne, please. Can you take a look at it? She said. Finally, I got around to checking the thermostat. Polly was right. The air should have been on. It wasn't. What else could I do? I went around opening all the windows again. Maybe it'd be cooler tomorrow. After almost a week, when it became clear that the heat was sticking, I made my way back into the basement again. But I discovered I had a problem bigger than my lethargy. The wood was sweating and buckling. Pieces I had already cut wouldn't fit right. I'd been planning on joint extensions to accommodate the humidity in South Carolina, humidity that I could count on. But what could I count on here? Probably I could work around the issue with my table creatively. Yes, I could manage it somehow. But no, I just stood there and admired the work I'd already done. It was too much to think about, too much energy and imagination. It was summertime. Living was supposed to be easy. The next day, one of Polly's Minnesota galleries called with the happy report that they'd gone through all but one of her drawings, and did she have any more? Polly had to give her miserable reply and also to ask, even more miserably, if she might be sent a check for what had already sold, even though it was for less than $200. It was humiliating for her. She sat with her head in her hands, a damp rag wrapped around the back of her neck. She was looking thin and weak. She couldn't eat. The stress and the jungle humidity were affecting her appetite. She went up to her bedroom. I peeked in at her once and saw her frowning in concentration, holding her paper in place with her cast and trying to draw with her left hand. Her gray-black hair was tied into a greasy ponytail, and her face was red with exertion. I told her she should take a cool shower to get her temperature down, but Polly said the water in the bathroom on the first floor was acting funny today. Hot water was coming out of the cold taps. I went to check it. "It's fine now, honey," I said. Polly frowned. "Well, I want to keep working anyway," she said. She took it up again the next day while I sat on the porch with my feet up and a glass in my hand, watching Kyle, doing nothing. I told myself that I had to go knock out a few hours of work on the maple table. It was the last week of June. I'd sent both my and Polly's share of the rent for July, and now I was really running low. I got down into the basement once, but only for a few minutes. I needed inspiration. I took a sweaty bike ride to a park. I suppose the trees there were nice, but that day there was something about them that I didn't like. They were all so tall and good, and they worked so hard to get through the big bad winters I was always hearing so much about. What could anyone make from a tree like that? They were so God-fearingly straight. I wanted something crooked, I suppose. After a week, Polly gave up trying to draw with her left hand. The drawings weren't getting better very quickly. "I guess I need to think of something else," she said. One day I sat Polly down on the porch with me and tried to help her think of a plan. I thought so hard, it gave me a headache, and I made myself a few drinks to relieve it. Polly put her legs up on a chair, showing her dirty bare feet. At one point, Kyle came to sit in the shade with us. We could hear Jim clanging around with the ladder on the side of the house. The sound was so bright it almost hurt. Even the birds were peeping lower. Kyle leaned back against a pillar and closed his eyes. When he dozed off, his angular, pretty face, which always seemed to be calculating its expression, it relaxed into something that was both cruder and more banal. His golden brown hair was curling in the damp heat. He woke and caught me watching him. He yawned and gestured to my glass. "You got another one of those?" he said. "I got a headache too." "You'll get dehydrated drinking in this heat while you're trying to work," Polly said, gently. "And you're not old enough." Kyle's eyes darkened. He turned an evil look on Polly. "How's that, ma'am?" he said. Lately, he had taken on the habit of addressing both Polly and me in an approximation of a general Southern accent, in what he may have imagined were genteel terms and greetings. "It's almost the end of the day anyway," I said, and got him a glass of cheap rosé. Then quickly things got much worse. I can see that now. Could I see it then? I must have, because I can remember everything Polly did and said, and everything that happened to her in sharp detail. She said the only time she felt all right was when she was falling asleep. When she was awake, I caught her muttering to herself. She glared at our beautiful pale-colored walls, crept carefully around every sunlit corner. But it was as if I were looking at her through the window of someone else's house, while the only person with me in this house anymore was Kyle. It was growing clearer than ever that Kyle was a miserable specimen of a human being, someone I wouldn't have looked at twice, even in the previous gutter periods of my life. On the days he came to work at all, he was late, and he took long, languid breaks out in the street, making the neighbors nervous with the gangster talk he fed his girlfriend on the phone. He spoke to his uncle like the know-it-all brat that he was, even though it was clearly apparent when he was working that if he had any talents at all, they were not in painting and construction. And yet, none of it kept me from obsessing over getting that rotten little sneak into my bed. He was nice enough to look at, fine, but usually I needed a story as well, a sweet spot. It didn't matter. Almost every morning, I woke to stare at him, silhouetted against the sun, his shirt off, his jeans sagging around his slender hips, his arm raised with a dripping brush. For a long time, I wouldn't get up. I'd turn around in the big bed to watch him, my hands crossed behind my head. I'd tap the window with my bare toe as he pressed his face to the screen, grinning like a ghoul. One very hot night in July, Polly and I ate dinner after dark on the porch. Or at least I ate. Polly was just picking at the cheap white foods, crackers, a little cream cheese that she could still choke down. I suggested to her that if she didn't trust the shower in her regular bathroom, she should take a cool bath on the 3rd floor. I was thinking as I looked at her that she could really use it. She looked dirtier than ever, and she was putting off a musty smell. Polly murmured that she'd see. When I began to insist, we got snappish with one another. "Never mind, Wayne," Polly said. "What's the problem? This isn't still about that window, is it?" Polly scowled, her dark eyebrows beetling together. "Polly, that's silly." She ignored me. "Wayne," she insisted, "we need to talk about Kyle." I smiled, sank back into my chair. "Ah, Polly, Just let me have some fun." "No," Polly said, "I won't. Because it won't be fun. You'll get obsessed. You won't sleep. You'll drink too much. And that little worm will make you spend all your money." Since we'd met, Polly and I had had this conversation maybe 15 or 20 times. I needed it. In fact, I relied on it. Polly knew that. But tonight, it hit me sourly. Polly began to rock in the porch swing. I noticed that her cast had gotten grungy from all the dust she roiled up with her broom. As I looked at her, I felt something in the atmosphere change. It pressed in on me and scattered parts of myself out into the oppressive evening. In order to feel that my mind and body were still contained together in one decent being, I had to focus hard. But it was too hot to focus, even if I hadn't been a little drunk. I sat up and looked at Polly critically in the yellowish light. God, when had she gotten so old? So ugly. In the past, I'd thought many times that with her olive skin and her dark hair and her patient, intelligent eyes, there were few women of any age who could hold a candle to Polly. But tonight, what I noticed were the deep, harsh wrinkles around her mouth. Her whole grayish face sagged with lines, like a sad, old, withered balloon left out to discolor in the rain. "My money? What? Are you afraid I won't have any left to bail you out?" I said. Polly stopped the chair from swinging and looked at me. "But think of all the times I've done it for you," she said. Anger rose in my throat. I jumped up and looked out into the yard without seeing it. Money? What was money? Money was nothing. In all our years together, I had given her things far more valuable than that. What a joyless, toiling life she would have had if it wasn't for me. I strode past her into the house and slammed the door. I felt bad about what I'd said to Polly as soon as I went upstairs. But I was so worn out from the heat, I fell asleep before I could get myself to go downstairs and find her. At 1 a.m, I was woken by howling. Polly, tormented even in her sleep. I ran down to her room on the 2nd floor. She was lying on her back, her cast propped on a pillow, drenched in sweat and breathing in gulps, hysterically. She smelled even worse than before. I steeled myself to stroke her oily hair. "I had a dream about my mother," she said. She said that it was nasty and dark, the details too grotesque to go into. At that, I felt a wave of sadness, so hopeless and profound that I almost had to get up and walk back out of the room. Because Polly's mother had been, while not the most practical woman in the world, the sweetest one, apart from Polly, that I had ever known. I held Polly's uninjured hand until she stopped sniffling. But then she began a long, high-pitched cry like a fox locked up in a cage. It got on my nerves so badly that I shook her. "Polly, please," I said. "I wish I could have done more for her, Wayne." "You were with her almost every minute. You hardly did anything else." Polly turned her face away. She said in a small, sulky voice, "I didn't want her to die in a place like that." It wasn't that bad. That was easy for me to say. Polly's penniless mother had died in an airless, state-run nursing home. While my own parents were not wealthy, they had plenty, no thanks to me. "She worked, and she worked, and then she died. I could have lived differently," Polly said. "You never were built for regular work, Polly." "Even if my hand heals, Even if the paintings keep doing well, none of it is going to help her now. Well, wasn't it kind of a relief, though, too? No, Polly said firmly. It might be to some people, but not to me. She closed her eyes and shook her head on the pillow like a child. I sat looking at her in the light coming in from the hall. At some point, I began to feel that Polly's hysterical gloominess was being reflected in the room, that she was making it oppressive, an effect magnified by her closed eyes, as if she were concentrating on creating it. I began to prickle with anxiety myself and sweat. The walls, the heat, the darkness were trying to squeeze me dry. If I could get away from Polly, I was sure it would stop. But how could I leave her now? The salty, rank smell and the sweet mustiness of the rumpled sheets intensified. The heat from Polly's body grew unbearable. The air smelled and even tasted revolting. I felt as if I were about to choke. "Polly, look at me," I said. That was a mistake. In the moment before she opened her eyes, I was gripped by the feeling that when she did, she would focus on something behind me, in the corner of the room. On what? The feeling was so unendurable that I had to preempt it by looking myself. There was the bureau, the pink walls, a lamp, a glass of water. I stared at it all until my eyes blurred. The familiarity of these things began to fill me with dread. Because if something were to happen, if a glass were to begin to rise, then a hand to form around it, one slender finger after another, then what would we have? Where could we go? When I looked back at the bed, Polly was half sitting up, her eyes on the wall. Then they flicked back to me, begging me for something. "Wayne," she cried, "do you see him too?" I shuddered. A stinging itch spread over my skin. I could feel a rash breaking out. "Polly, nothing's going to hurt you here," I said. Polly blinked. "What are you looking at?" I said. "What do you mean? I'm looking at you." "Polly," I said. "It's not just me he's after," she muttered. "Stop it," I said. After a moment, I sighed unsteadily. I felt that this might be all my fault. I had been making those stupid jokes about a ghost. Now we were both infected. "I'm sorry," I said. "You liked it here at first." "Every day I sit here waiting for for something else to happen," she said. "Don't do that," I said. "I can't settle down, Wayne. What if it's always like this?" "We're only here until the end of the summer, and you'll feel better when it's cooler." "I mean always," Polly said. "No matter where I go." I sat with her for another little while. When she'd finally dozed off, I kissed her and left, my head and belly still itchy. Out of her room, I did begin to feel better. I felt the rash ease away. But once I was asleep, I had a wild dream as well, about Kyle. A feverish vision that woke me up slowly, in a dream within a dream kind of way. And then a bang, so shattering that I thought the walls were falling in. It was so loud that it couldn't have been real. It didn't wake up Polly. A sound, then, just for me. It shook me so completely that for several moments I believed in it, believed in the sound outside of my own head, but also in the fact that nothing I could see or know had made it. The door had not slammed. My book had not fallen. Bit by bit, there grew the feeling of a heaviness beside me on the bed. My skin got clammy. I guess I was terrified. I was also charged up, excited from the dream. I closed my eyes without turning my head to look. Then I couldn't open them. I thought I felt a slight shift on the mattress. I finally got my eyes open and saw a blue glow. I gasped, sat up, ran my hand back hard through my hair. I'd left the bathroom door open. A street light coming through a sapphire-colored window in there had made me think again that Polly might be right, that there really was someone in the room, and that his eyes were so close to me, I could see their color in the dark. When I opened my eyes in the burning sunshine, the air in the room was more hellish than ever, and I had a nauseating ache all over my body. A Charlie horse in my foot got so bad that I yelled, but I was more keyed up about Kyle than ever. When I thought of Polly, I felt a wave of helplessness. Something had changed last night. Yes, I'd given in to something. All I knew was that there was no way I was leaving this house before getting what I wanted. I limped down to the first floor, and Polly was suddenly rushing past me through the open sweep of front rooms. She opened the bathroom door and threw me a strange, haunted look over her shoulder. Then she locked herself in. I heard her throwing up, then crying. I knocked on the door. "Are you hungover?" I said. "What's the matter?" There was a long pause. Then she said, "We need to leave this house. Today." "Today?" I said. "And if you can't do that, then just go away and let me die, all right?" "What are you talking about?" I said. "Are you sick? Why would you die? Tell me what I can get you, Polly." "I went down to the basement," Polly said. "That table doesn't look any different than it did when we got here. Polly, I promise you, get me out of here, or go to hell, Wayne," she said. I stood outside the door, drumming my fingers on my chest. Finally, I said, "It's the heat that's making you sick. You need to go somewhere cool for a while." "Guess what?" I told her. "I'm taking you out to lunch today." There was a long silence in the bathroom. I waited, sitting on the polished wood, my cheek against the door. Finally, Polly said in a low voice that if I wanted to stay, fine, I could do whatever it was I thought I needed to do here, but I was going to get her out. I could scrape up the money for a bus ticket to get her out of town. She would figure out where she was going to go and what she was going to do later. But she had to get out of this place today, or it was going to kill her. She would buy a ticket herself, but her credit cards were maxed out and her parents were both dead, and she didn't have anyone else to call. And if anyone was going to give her the money, it was going to be me. I owed her that much. I sat still for a second, then almost out of a mix of sadness and relief, almost laughed. I held it in, thank God. I had the impulse only because it had never occurred to me that I could do this for her. For 25 years, Polly and I had been the best of friends, had almost always spoken to one another several times a week, and had been roommates for much of that time. Maybe that's why I hadn't considered the possibility that even though we had come here to St. Paul together, we could go our separate ways at any time. I told her that I would get her the money for a ticket at once. I picked up my phone and checked my accounts. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done it, and I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Even for me, this was bad. I drained my checking down to $75. My savings had even less. My credit card was miraculously still in good standing, though I had only a couple hundred on that. I left the house and at a cash machine took out the $200 left on my credit card. I put the cash in the secret compartment of my wallet. Back at the house, I found Polly napping on a sofa in one of the front rooms. And I decided I needed a little rest myself. It had been a long night. I went up to the 3rd floor, where I found Kyle standing in my room. If he was alarmed, he didn't show it. He smiled, as if he'd been expecting me. He stood with his fingers trailing on the big bed. The drawer on the nightstand was open. Maybe I'd left it that way this morning, after groping for an aspirin. Kyle's feet were bare. He wore a white sleeveless shirt. His hand was tan against the pale blue of the sheets. Around him, the room conspired in a softening play of watery green light. A spike seemed to go through the back of my skull. It came out right above my eye. I pressed the spot with my hand. "You still having those headaches?" Kyle said in that strange adopted twang. He crinkled his eyes. "Y'all want me to try something for you?" He said that his girlfriend knew about pressure points, and he told me to lie down on the bed. I was surprised. I was hardly ready for it. I remember unbuttoning and taking off my shirt. The pain of my desire was acute, but my pleasure was not. Surely that would change when I touched him. I watched Kyle watch me. He was smiling faintly, with a kind of professional patience. Once I was on the bed, lying on my stomach, I felt his legs astride my hips. No, this wasn't right. We had everything backwards. But the heat in that stifling room was working on me like a drug. He rubbed my scalp, and I fell asleep. Waking up hours later, alone in the twilight, I lay for several minutes. I felt dizzy and uneasy. I tried to tell myself I'd had a good nap and that Kyle and I had crossed a barrier. Next time I would anticipate the moment, and I wouldn't let it pass me by. But in truth, I did not feel rested at all. Finally, almost leisurely, I pulled my wallet out of my pocket. It must have taken quite a trick to replace it without waking me up. The boy was not untalented, and he hadn't just tossed it. That took some style. Of course, the $200 was gone. I lay there for a while, looking around the room. I noticed only now that one of the window screens was leaning up against the wall. Kyle must have removed it and climbed into my room from the scaffolding. Slowly, I got up. I closed the window to keep the bugs out. The house was very quiet. But Polly was down there somewhere, probably sitting with the hot lights turned off, waiting, with all her bags packed. It turned out worse than I could have imagined. Her strange, distant look of this afternoon was gone. When I came into the kitchen, she stood up and smiled a little, looking almost hopeful again. When I told her Kyle had stolen my money, she looked as startled as if I'd slapped her. Her dark eyes still wide open, she began to cry. "Why am I so stupid?" she said. "Why did I think I could count on you?" "Well, I'm such a fuck-up. I guess you should have known better." "When you go after the most rotten thing you can find," she said, "it makes you rotten too." "Well, maybe you like it," I said. "You're so goddamn pure yourself." "At least I'm not lazy. I'd die to be able to work. You could do it if you tried." "You don't know a thing about wood," I said. Polly stopped crying. She looked at me hard. She sat down at the table and said, "You're trying to get back at me." "For God's sakes, Polly, you were jealous. All that time I spent with my mother. I loved your mother." "Whining and complaining," Polly said, "trying to get me to come to you. I didn't ask you to come." "I thought you might drink yourself to death," she said, "but I couldn't leave. You knew that. You just wanted me to feel terrible." "You could have called at least," I said. "It wouldn't have been enough. You always want more." "I could have died too," I said. You wouldn't have lasted until 40 if it wasn't for me," said Polly. Maybe she was right. These last few weeks in the house had made me feel that inside I was weak, maybe even foul. But while I may have been rotten inside, on Polly the wretchedness showed. And for whatever damnable reason, on that night, her fault seemed worse. Polly was gaunt, sallow, crushed, nervous and stiff, desperate and starved, with her dirty graying hair, her clothes covered in dust. "Go take a goddamn bath, Polly," I said. "You really smell like shit." Polly stared at me. Then she ran out of the room. I stood still only a second before following her. Through the kitchen and the front rooms, I was gaining on her. I could still almost have touched her as she began to run up the stairs. I rounded the corner to get onto the second level. I was going to get her. I was going to pull her back. Instead, I stopped. He was standing in front of me. Don't try to ask me what he looked like. Translucent, hovering above the ground, solid as a rock. I don't know. I don't care either. A young man, I guess. If something that careless and heartless can be associated with anything human. Hair dark brown, about the color mine had been when I was young. A blaze of a face. When he saw he had my attention, he gave me a little smile. Polly was now beyond me. I heard two sounds at once. A window on the third floor went up. Downstairs, the doorbell began to ring. The front door opened, and I heard Kyle quietly call my name, still sounding like a weasel. But his cry of shock was real when out in the yard behind him, he heard Polly hit the ground